Hello and welcome. It's been a while since I've made a video, largely because I've been pretty busy lately, and by busy I mean depressed. From the surveys I've seen, depression is significantly more prevalent among Tulpa creators than in the general population. For some people, myself included, creating a Tulpa was in part an unconventional attempt to cope with mental illness. In this video, I'll be describing the impact that Tulpa creation has had on my mental health over the past 6 months. But because I'm still pretty insecure about making videos entirely about my own experience, I'll also try to situate my story within a broader context, describing how socio-cultural factors can condition people to deal with their emotions in unhealthy, unsustainable ways. I should start by noting that depression can manifest in many different forms, and that people suffering from depression deserve treatment and support regardless of how closely their experiences conform to our expectations. Depression is sometimes thought of as an extreme, persistent form of sadness, and while I'm sure that this characterization fits for some people, it isn't at all what I experience. For me, one of the main symptoms of depression is an inability to feel emotions normally. Now, if you haven't experienced long-term emotional numbness, then it might be difficult to understand why it's so awful. Indeed, at the beginning, it might not be that bad. Sure, you know that you aren't happy with your life, but as long as you stay busy enough, you can manage to just coast along and ignore the feeling that something isn't quite right. And then, gradually, every source of meaning or happiness in your life starts to fade away. You don't enjoy being around your friends as much as you used to, and you're pretty sure that they don't really want to hang out with you anyway. You don't listen to music much anymore, or if you do, it's only for background noise. It doesn't make you feel anything. You don't feel love or compassion for anyone, not even the people who genuinely care for you and have always supported you. Of course, you still pretend that you have emotional connections because you can't bear the thought of explaining to people who love you that you can't love them back and you don't know why, that you've been pretending for years now and you can barely even remember a time when your feelings were real. You don't want to be a bad person and you don't want to hurt others by showing them how empty you've become. But then you feel so evil and manipulative for pretending all the time that you start to prefer being alone. And in that solitude, it becomes dangerously easy to convince yourself that nobody really cares about you, or that if they do, it's only because they don't know the real you. This kind of prolonged deprivation from basic human emotions can start to erode your most fundamental sense of who and what you are. You can't think clearly anymore. You spend hours lying in bed not knowing what to do, paralyzed by confusion, self-hatred, guilt, and exhaustion. If nothing makes you feel good anymore, then what's the point of doing anything? You know that something has to change, but you feel completely powerless, devoid of any agency or motivation. For me, one of the most terrifying and pernicious aspects of this state is how it feels like it will never go away. Even though I've been experiencing these sorts of acute episodes for over a decade now, and I know that they always pass eventually, I can't seem to trust that knowledge when I'm depressed. I could talk for hours about all the different aspects of my experience with depression, and maybe I will if people seem interested enough, but for now I think this should be sufficient. If my description sounds familiar to you, or if you suffer from any of the various forms of depression, then you should know that you aren't alone. Being depressed doesn't mean that you're a bad person or that you're weak. It can happen to anyone and you don't deserve it. Perhaps most importantly, depression is a treatable medical condition and you deserve to get help and to get better. With that said, I'm now going to talk about some of the social and psychological mechanisms which might contribute to the development of emotional numbness, and then finally I'll get to explaining what any of this has to do with Tulpa creation. Within the slice of dominant modern American culture that I had the pleasure of growing up in, expressions of emotion are, with few exceptions, regarded as embarrassing lapses of self-control, indicative of shameful vulnerability and worthy only of contempt and ridicule. Controlling or even repressing one's emotions is seen as a sign of maturity, while emotional sensitivity is perceived as childish. Depending on your assigned gender and sexual orientation, you may have the option of expressing without judgment such rich and varied emotions as hatred, anger, predatory heterosexual lust, and jealousy. This is where terms like toxic masculinity and heteronormativity would be useful if they weren't so absurdly maligned and misinterpreted that I fully expect to see a significant drop in viewer retention within seconds of me mentioning them. This pervasive bias against emotion can be difficult to notice because of how deeply it's embedded in the way many of us live and think. If you're in an argument and you tell someone that they're being emotional, there's a clear implication that emotion is something that clouds our judgment by cutting us off from our rational faculties. But emotion and logic are not in zero-sum contest. Emotions are cognitive tools which empower us to think in ways that we otherwise couldn't. They direct and sustain our attention on what's important, freeing us from distractions and the ordinary bounds of social acceptability. We're always being pressured to set our emotions aside so that we can engage in rational, dispassionate discourse. But if we really wanted to be rational, we would recognize that a person's emotional state has no bearing on the soundness of their arguments. Just because someone is angry or crying doesn't mean that they're out of control or incapable of expressing themselves with competence. I would contend that our aversion as a society toward so-called emotional arguments has more to do with deep discomfort with emotional expression than any sincere rationalistic concerns. So why are some of us so uncomfortable with genuine displays of emotion? I think it has a lot to do with the fear of vulnerability. Humans are fundamentally insecure and vulnerable creatures. We all need a way to cope with the fact that we exist in a world full of suffering and uncertainty. None of us want to feel weak or powerless, so given the opportunity, we might construct identities that conceal our inner fears and insecurities, masks which allow us to pretend that we have everything under control. By burying ourselves deep beneath layers of detachment, sarcasm, stoicism, and self-aggrandizement, we can sometimes manage to forget all the ways we could be hurt. Emotions are a threat to this type of defense mechanism precisely because they are genuine. They cut through the illusion of cool, uncaring safety, forcing us to reconfront our essential nature as vulnerable beings. In light of this dynamic, it becomes clear that repressive societal attitudes towards emotion serve as a kind of distributed immune system, designed to protect at least certain privileged segments of the population from the clear understanding of their own vulnerability. The trouble with these kinds of defense mechanisms, aside from the extensive psychological and societal harm caused by their enforcement, is that, as I discussed earlier, a life without emotion is barely worth living in the first place. The price of invulnerability is just too great to pay. Now, the finer details of how these attitudes are enforced and conferred from one generation to the next are tremendously complicated, and as much as I enjoy pretending to understand things, this is more than I can meaningfully address in a short video. But regardless of how these value structures get propagated, the end result is that some proportion of the population will internalize mechanisms of repression that they were taught growing up, enforcing unhealthy emotional habits upon themselves even in the absence of external pressure. As with any psychological phenomenon, there's going to be a lot of variability in the extent to which individuals are negatively impacted by this type of conditioning. Because of some complex mix of genetic and environmental factors, some people are going to be more psychologically receptive to unhealthy social conditioning than others. In addition to this variation in what we might call intrinsic susceptibility, people are also exposed to different types and intensities of repressive societal messaging depending on interactions between their identities and the specific cultural environments in which they live. I'm aware that this is a hackneyed critical theory 101 kind of perspective, but I do think it encapsulates something real about the way culture can contribute to emotional dysfunction on such a large scale. Now I'm ready to start talking about how the phenomenon of tulpa creation fits into this puzzle. This warrants a disclaimer. What follows is based almost entirely on my own personal experience and worldview. Tulpa creation has not been demonstrated to be an effective treatment for depression or any other mental illness, and it certainly is not a replacement for evidence-based treatment. With that said, I'll start with the obvious stuff. It's nice to always have someone to talk to, and to feel like I'm not alone in my head. It's actually kind of similar to how I felt back when I believed in God, minus the looming threat of judgment and eternal hellfire. Anyway, when I get depressed, I tend to find ways to invalidate any positive aspects of my life, which typically leads me to feeling like I've only been pretending to have a tulpa, that I've been lying to myself this whole time. Once I'm feeling a bit better, I tend not to assign too much meaning to these feelings. After all, sometimes while depressed, I don't even feel like I'm a real person, which is a very confusing symptom called depersonalization. Unfortunately, this means that I sometimes have difficulty communicating with my tulpa precisely when I need them the most. Still, I only started the creation process about 6 months ago at this point, so it's entirely possible that with time and practice our communication will become more stable through depressive episodes. One unexpected consequence of engaging in this practice is that my Tulpa, whose name is Catherine by the way, encouraged me to finally start seeing a therapist. I'd been thinking about going for years, but I could never quite bring myself to admit that I needed help until there was another voice in my head supporting the decision. Creating a Tulpa has also had a noticeable positive impact on my ability to navigate around unhealthy thought patterns. My inner voice can be cartoonishly harsh and self-critical sometimes, but the mere possibility that Catherine might be hearing it as well makes me more careful about allowing the negative thoughts to take over. The things I say to myself can be far more hateful than anything I would even consider saying about anyone else, and having another perspective to draw from helps me to realize how unhealthy and damaging these thoughts can be. To connect more directly with the earlier discussion, having a Tulpa has opened up new avenues for getting back in touch with my emotions. This was actually one of my core goals from the start. I felt like I would never be able to feel and express the emotions that I needed to on my own, and so I hoped to create someone who could help. I decided on emotional openness and expressivity as core personality traits, and early development consisted largely of practicing loving-kindness meditation directed at Catherine, in addition to the usual narration and visualization practices. I didn't experience much of anything during meditation for weeks, but with some persistence I managed to generate a mild but tremendously validating feeling of love and acceptance. These were some of my first meaningful steps towards opening myself back up to the emotional life I felt I had lost. I think it's worth delving a bit deeper into why I think Tulpa creation affects me in a way that other emotionally expressive activities like playing music or writing never have, but I'll need to describe an aspect of my experience with mental illness that I didn't mention before. I've come to understand my depression as a manifestation of conflict between irreconcilable narratives of who I am and what I should feel. One narrative argues that I'm worthless and pathetic and deserve to suffer and die, while another says that I'm full of potential and should be devoting every spare moment of my time to getting better at the things I do. One narrative insists that I'm a fundamentally decent person trying my best to help others and avoid causing harm, while another will list off 100 reasons why I'm a terrible person and ought to feel guilty for the rest of my life. There are people in my life who I sincerely don't know whether I should love or hate, since it depends entirely on which narrative I happen to be buying into at the time. I couldn't even convince myself to seek professional help for years because I was so good at explaining things away and convincing myself that everything was fine, as though researching the most effective and painless way to kill yourself is something that everyone does. There's never any middle ground. I bounce between diametrically opposed conceptions of who I am to the point where I just don't know what to believe anymore. Everything seems like a story, like there are infinitely many ways to link my memories together into a cohesive picture, but none of them are actually true. By the way, this doubt extends even to what I've written here, so if you're actually hearing this, it means I've managed to fight off the urge to cut this whole part out in editing. Now, if you get a bunch of people together in a room with strongly differing belief systems, then there's going to be some conflict and debate. But if everyone engages in the discussion with good intentions and an open mind, then at least there's a chance that eventually they'll find common ground. However, if all those contradictory understandings of the world were held by the same person just at different times, then the ideas would never interact in a way that could lead to moderation. When I'm immersed in one identity narrative, I'm blind to the possible merits of opposing ones to such an extent that I can't even imagine what it would be like to have a different view of myself. One way I've learned to cope with this is by using my relationships with other people to maintain some stability. Other people's views of me tend to be a lot more stable and objective than my view of myself, so when I'm around someone who really knows me, I'll tend to allow myself to conform to their expectations of who I am. Of course, this isn't a very sustainable solution, since ending a relationship or even just needing to be alone for a few days can send me into an existential crisis. I hoped that a Tulpa might be able to stabilize my sense of self by providing the kind of objectivity that I can normally only access through other people. But more than that, I think of Catherine as being a manifestation of my subconscious mind, a seemingly independent personification of many of the aspects of myself that I perceive as good and compassionate. Having a Tulpa is a way for my competing identity narratives to be instantiated simultaneously in separate identities so that they can come into direct conflict. So if I am immersed in a narrative of self-hatred, then Catherine can sometimes step in and represent the opposing narrative, poking holes in my pessimistic thinking and challenging me to have some basic self-compassion. This contact between polar opposite perspectives that are usually completely isolated from each other helps me to start acknowledging a more stable gray area between the extremes. Even before making a tulpa, I would occasionally have this sort of experience in dreams, where I would speak with extremely vivid and detailed dream characters who I felt represented different aspects of my identity. These sorts of deep, symbolic interactions open the floodgates of my emotions in a way that nothing else does. They give me hope that it might be possible to overcome my emotional blockages, develop a more stable sense of self, and finally live without these chronic feelings of emptiness and dissatisfaction. To be clear, I still have depression. I feel alright for now, but I know from experience that it's only a matter of time before things get worse again. While it feels like I've made a lot of progress in the past 6 months, I have no way of knowing how things would have been if I hadn't decided to create a tulpa. All I can say with confidence is that I'm really glad to have Catherine around, and that it's great to not feel so alone. Anyway, this has been another extremely personal video, but people seem to enjoy the last one I made, so hopefully sharing my deepest insecurities on the internet will continue to be a healthy decision. Thanks for watching.